All right, let's finish up with chapter 15. I was talking about the case study of Temple Grandin. Here's a picture of a movie that was made based on this book called Thinking in Pictures and starred Claire Danes. Here's an actual image of Temple Grandin, who said that Claire Danes really captured her essence, except for she was a better looking version of her. And I have to agree, seeing videos of Temple Grandin and actually watching this movie, Claire Danes does a wonderful job of capturing the essence of her. I first became aware of Temple Grandin by reading one of Dr. Oliver Sacks' book. If you recall, Dr. Sacks is the author of many books, including Awakenings and The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. My favorite neurologist passed away a few years ago. Rest in peace. Miss him. And what struck me about Temple Grandin was that she was pretty early diagnosed as being, at that time, we would say mentally retarded, right? Today we would say intellectually challenged, but as a child, her speech was not very well developed. And it was recommended by a doctor that maybe she should be put in an institution. Her mother didn't give up on her. Her mother realized, even though her daughter wasn't very verbal and didn't really make a whole lot of eye contact and seemed detached, she saw her daughter humming music that her mother had played earlier on the piano, so she knew that her daughter was focused. Her daughter would have all kinds of tantrums, difficulties, and eventually she sent her daughter to live with a relative on a ranch. Here, Temple blossomed. She had a connection with animals, especially the cattle. And she goes through school and she notices that when she has tantrums, the only thing that can comfort her is something similar to what happens with the cattle. When they're about to be branded, they stick them in a cattle press and hold them in place. They seem to get very calm. So she creates her own so-called cattle press for herself. Well, of course, the high school psychologist finds out about this and has it taken away from her. So much for psychologists knowing what to do. And here's a woman who goes through college, gets through graduate school, and becomes the foremost expert at cattle facilities. She recognizes that cattle, when they're going through to be slaughtered, respond to stimuli. Any kind of movement or sound, for example, that fan floating above my head, is going to be very disruptive to them. And they're not going to cooperate. And she said the worst thing she ever saw was cattle being mistreated at these cattle facilities. So she designs her own cattle facilities and she makes them into a circular pattern, which is a natural cattle movement. And she reduces flags waving or eerie sounds that would frighten them. She said, if we're going to consume them, let's give them its most comforting environment they can have before perishing. Now, I was extremely impressed by this woman who falls under the spectrum disorder. We would probably classify her in the past as Asperger's syndrome, very high functioning, gets her doctorate, world expert at cattle facilities, but also she eventually becomes a spokesperson for autism spectrum disorder. A few years pass, and I have a student, and I always like it when former students stay in touch. The only thing I ever ask of students is to send me graduation pictures so I can see how they're progressing through life. And this student says, hey, I remember you mentioning Temple Grandin in Abnormal Psych. Guess what? She's coming to UCI. You should go see her. So, I said, absolutely. So just the other day, 2012, I got this advertisement and I saw that Temple was going to speak. So here's a person that is kind of like a superstar to me, right? Somebody who's able to overcome such great issues, and yet, here's a picture of some of the cattle facilities she's designed, right? and 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 persevere, right? And become so successful, but also suffering from autism. So I'm expecting this person who's going to be a little bit detached, but very formal and so forth. So I'm quite shocked when I get in line to, I already got my ticket, and when I get in line to go see her, she's outside of the venue by a book stand, which is selling her various publications, and she's musing with the audience. So I go over there and I introduce myself, and she asked me what I teach and so forth. So I happened to get a couple things signed. I asked if she could sign them because this is part of our library in the psych lab, and she signs the book that I had already read for me. And I love her signature because it just shows me that my theory is correct. The more education you get, the worse your handwriting gets, right? She was very different than I expected. Her presentation was engaging. She did ask people to put down their phones so they wouldn't record, because when they record, sometimes a light pops on, and that's very distracting, like the cattle, very distracting to her, so she'll lose her train of thought. And she goes on to talk about how a lot of folks who are heads of Fortune 500 companies probably fall in the spectrum, but she's not going to out them. She's going to let them out themselves. And her main thrust was that she'd much rather be preferred to be seeing somebody with a doctorate in animal science and a designer of facilities who also happens to be a spokesperson for autism. But her message to parents, especially, is to find that talent that child has. Very much like her mother saw potential in her and didn't give up with her. And find something that the kids can do. Don't write them off and say, well, they're limited, there's not much they can do, those have to be cared for the rest of their lives. No, kids have different potential, right? So again, around age 2, we're making the diagnosis, and there's a lot of controversy as to why we're getting more and more cases of autism today. Does it have something to do with the chemicals we're using these days, the amount of pollution, and so forth? Possibly, but I think part of it is our better ability to diagnose, right? We do know that something neurologically is going on. Temple Grandin talked about her difficulties in processing information. She had hearing difficulties, and of course, if you can't process words correctly, it's very difficult for you to speak the words. She really thought that people that talk too fast were speaking gibberish, right? So we know that there's some genetic components. We're learning more and more about this each day. And fortunately, we have a lot of very talented people making headway. No cure, so to speak, because it is a spectrum disorder, right? There's a lot of variation, but certainly better treatment modalities. And guess what? This notion of being in a squeeze box, like the cattle, like Temple found out for herself, it's also one of the forms of treatment, right? Wrapping bandages around. So, Temple talks about this notion of wanting so desperately to be hugged, right? By ones that cared for her, but at the same time having it feel so painful, right? Even certain type of clothing or certain noises being so painful to her that it's kind of like a push-pull thing. And so parents early in this diagnosis, before we even realized what it was, they were thinking, my kid doesn't even love me. And some parents were blamed for being refrigerator mothers, right? You didn't give your child affection. That's why they're detached. That's why they're not looking at you. That's why they don't seem to like affection. Those poor moms had to suffer from that blame. Prognosis is mixed. Some kids respond very early to treatment, and that's the advice. The earlier, the better. Some parents live in denial, so they don't get their kids any help early on. So when in doubt, get it checked out. Start treatment early. It's like anything else, right? If I'm having trouble with math, the earlier you expose me to practice, I can get better at it, right? Practice, practice, practice. And the same thing with, in many cases, with autism spectrum. if we're working on my language skills or social skills, the earlier I start, the more easier it is for me to transition. This notion that, oh, it's the injections, right? It's the vaccinations that causes autism. That got started by kind of a wacky doctor we were not able to replicate his so-called findings. But people, will believe what they want to believe, right? And there's little to no validity to that whatsoever. But again, people will use that as an excuse not to vaccinate their kids. Now, the questions. One is going to be on the Temple Grandin case study and my personal connection with her and what her diagnosis was. And the other one deals with oppositional defiant and conduct disorder, and specifically society's role, right? Do we give up on kids? Do we label them and let them go through the systems so that eventually their main goal is death or the penitentiary? We've got to do better in our society. And that's why I'm excited when I teach these classes, because I know many of you are going to go into the helping profession in some form or fashion with knowledge, and knowledge is power, and you can change the world. I've been working on it. I know you can continue with that struggle. Thank you for your attention.